Hello, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to resume our series, our seemingly endless series on the Ruy Lopez, which we've ironically and jestingly called the Quick Ruy, although we've been making some progress. And today we're going to make quite a bit more progress, and what we're going to look at are fourth move alternatives to the main line for black. So after bishop e5, a6, bishop a4, we're going to take a look at moves other than knight to f6 here, or major moves other than knight to f6. So I'm going to look at three moves. Maybe calling all of them major is a bit of an overstatement, but they do have their relevance. They're interesting, and we should cover them. So the moves we're going to look at are b5, the so-called Norwegian defense, and it was called that well before Carlsen. I'm not sure if Carlsen has ever played that, but anyway, Salmon Agdestein, who was his trainer and a former world junior champion, most certainly did play it. And some other Norwegian GMs have given it a try as well. There's the delayed Schliemann, or delayed Jänisch if you prefer, with f5. And there's some crucial differences between this and the regular Schliemann, or Jänisch. And then finally, a really major, genuinely major move for d6, the Steinitz defense deferred. Alright, so let's begin with the Norwegian. So this is b5, bishop to b3, and now the characteristic move, knight to a5. Black is simply going to grab the bishop here and hope that in the long run it'll pay off. So if he can neutralize white's space advantage and slight lead in development, then he can look forward to the future with confidence, knowing that the bishop here may at some point become a major factor. Now, I'm going to show you two lines from here. The main line is castles, and it's what I would recommend in a tournament game, I think. But this sacrifice is also a lot of fun, and it seems to be, in a way, a principled approach because, black is not developing, the knight's on a5, so why shouldn't we have something good here? So we grab a couple of pawns, we drive his king out, we get a nice center. So after king e7, d4, knight f6, castles, white has at least fair compensation for the piece. In fact, I played this way in a blitz game against a Norwegian GM earlier this year. It wasn't Carlsen, it wasn't the Norwegian GM, so a relatively minor GM, certainly by comparison, but still, it was a Norwegian Grandmaster, so that made it kind of entertaining. Anyway, here probably the best move for black is d6, but my opponent played bishop to b7. And this was, I think, a 3-minute game, so the quality is not going to be staggeringly high, but it's, I think, an interesting game and not altogether unrepresentative, where you could say without all the double negatives there, without all the negatives, it's somewhat representative of what kinds of things white can hope for. So queen to e1 is better than rook to e1 because of the hit on the knight on a5. That's the idea. But rook to e1 is certainly a very sensible move. All right, the game continued. Queen to e8, bishop d2, knight c6, takes, d5, bishop to b7, c4. So you can see I have this nice expansion in the center. I do have my two pawns for the piece. His king is not going to be safe anytime soon. So I still think that this is a reasonable position for white. Okay, he played king to d8, so his queen and king castled. And here I probably should have played e5 straight away, but I played queen to b3 to put some pressure kind of in advance. So it's like a welcoming party for his king on the queen side, except that the welcome will be slightly unpleasant for him. All right, here black perhaps should play bishop to c5, or even the slightly paradoxical bishop to d6, walking into the pin, but there's no way, well, pin if I play e5. But there doesn't seem to be any way for me to exploit this. And he's threatening things like queen h5 or knight g4, maybe in some cases bishop h2 check, although I don't believe that's a threat here. But maybe with rook to f8 it could be a threat. So anyway, this could be interesting, and here I'd probably be a bit worse, which is why, again, here I should have played e5. Anyway, queen to b3, he played queen to g6, now I played knight to c3, and here maybe knight to g4, e5, bishop c5, knight e4. I mean, I had seen this, but the engine thinks that this is actually decent for black, although I'm not really sold on this. Bishop c3, okay, here's where I decided to stop the line, and it thinks that black is better here. I have a hard time believing this, certainly in the context of a game between human beings, but maybe it's true. Okay, engines can defend ridiculous things. So perhaps black is better here, but I wouldn't count on my opponents finding any of that. Anyway, my opponent played b4. I played e5. And he played king to c8 to protect the bishop on b7. I took, he took, and I took with the pawn so I could open the b file. And here he absolutely had to play rook to b8. It's the only move to stay alive. So he played g takes f6, grabbing the pawn and hoping that the g file would work out for him, but the bad news is that the b file works out for me more quickly. Because after rook to b1, the bishop's got no moves. And after rook to b8, bishop to e3, there isn't a thing he can do about bishop to a7, except to delay it by a move. Rook to g8, g3, and here he resigned. There's just no defense to bishop a7. If the rook moves, I take the bishop, then I take the rook. Well, and I'm even mating him, and it's a disaster. So he has no defense here and resigned. All right, so we saw that this is certainly very, very interesting, very sharp, and I think entirely playable, at least for blitz, and maybe for a tournament game too. But the kind of calm, you know, keeping everything, let's say, nice and safe and tidy, and not overcommitting with just castling should be good enough for an edge. So d6, d4, knight b3, a b3. So this is the idea. Black grabs his bishop here, and now plays f6, and it looks like it's weakening, but remember, we don't have a light squared bishop, so it's really not such a big deal. And it'll complement the light squared bishop. So knight c3, threatening to take on b5, bishop to b7, and now knight h4. So we're trying to take advantage of the fact that the bishop has quit the c8 h3 diagonal. And again, this should be good for an edge. So give a couple of variations here. One is knight to e7. I mean, the threat is queen h5 check, of course, followed by knight to g6. So here and then there. So knight to e7 takes care of that. It gives the g6 pawn enough support when it gets there. So here, d takes e5. Now, if de, white should just play queen to e2, put a rook on d1, maybe play for f4 at some point. We got to be careful about f4, ef, bishop f4, g5, but well, it doesn't seem to work very well for black right away because of queen h5. Anyway, that's an idea. Putting a rook on d1 is an idea. Playing bishop b3, maybe bishop c5 is an idea. So a lot of things look pretty promising for white here. It's a pretty comfortable position. Alternatively, black could play f takes e5, and then b4 seems to be a pretty good move, trying to prevent black from putting the pawn on c5 in a safe way. So here it would allow takes, queen h5 check. All right, so white's slightly better here. Instead of knight to e7, black could also play queen to d7, which I think is the main move. Let me take a quick look, see which one's more frequently played. Actually, knight to e7 is the more frequently played move. All right, so queen to d7. The idea here is queen h5 check, queen f7. But now knight to d5. Okay, so from here, if black plays queen f7, then c4 is significantly better for white. And on knight e7, now check. And here, g6, knight takes f6 check is the problem. So king d8, c4, and white is again in very good shape. So I don't think that the Norwegian variation is particularly appealing, even on the better knight to e7. White should be slightly better here, and even the piece sacrifice line isn't so bad. So I wouldn't really recommend this variation. It's not terribly popular, and I think there's a reason why, but I would also say that it's certainly not terrible. And if white doesn't play incisively, I mean, again, black does have the bishop here, so white does need to make something happen, or he could be worse in the long run. All right, let's turn to the second of the sublines, or his minor variations, f5. Now, there are a couple of key differences here between this and the regular Yanish. All right, so first of all, well, we'll look at three differences. So, okay, we'll start with the most minor response here, d3. And the difference here between this and the Yanish proper is that after takes, knight f6, castles, bishop c5, in the regular Yanish with the bishop back on b5 and the pawn back on a7, the lines where white plays queen d3 or queen to e2 are very, very popular. But here, black just plays b5, and he has no problems at all. So it cuts out all of these tricks with the queen going to c4 and the pressure against the pawn on e5. So this is perfectly good for black. Okay, next important point is that knight c3 is it has some similarities, but some important differences. One good way to play here might be knight to f6, and this is not considered to be so fantastic, again, in the regular Schliemann after e takes f5, e4, but here it does seem to be all right. So those of you who are interested in pursuing this might want to look into this line some more, but the main line for white on move 5 is d4. So I do want to say one other thing about knight to c3 though. So f e4 instead of knight f6. If black plays f takes e4, knight e4, b5. So another difference, bishop to b3. And now here, d5 is the obvious move. And on a, let's say, on a calm move by white, black is in terrific shape. But you should be aware of this tricky move, knight takes e5. So this could be very, very interesting. Knight e5, queen h5 check. Knight to g6, bishop takes d5, rook b8, and castles. Black should probably play knight 8 to e7 here. But white has 2 pawns for the piece and some very aggressively posted pieces. Black's king is clearly not going to find its way to a permanently safe location anytime soon. So this kind of would bother me a bit if I were black playing this line. So after knight to c3, instead of f e4, knight e4, and walking this knight e5 trick, well, I mean, I don't know that it wins for white by any means, but I wouldn't want to have the burden of playing it. So I would probably suggest this knight f6 and then e4 line. Anyway, the main move here by a long way is d4, and this is probably good for an edge. Now, this is crucially different once again from the regular Yanish, because after f takes e4, which would be the right move there, knight e5, d e5, when the bishop's back on b5, black has c6, hitting the bishop with the idea, so when this is here and that's here, when the bishop retreats someplace, let's say to e2, then there's queen a5 check, and queen takes e5, which is why after c6, again in the position where the bishop's back on b5, white plays this interesting piece sack with knight c3, c takes b5, knight e4, and so on. So that was covered in the earlier shows on the Schliemann. You can look it up there. I just point out that here it makes a big difference. The move c6 after white recaptures the knight does absolutely nothing. I mean, white can just castle with a pretty serious advantage. So this is not a good line for black. Instead of knight takes e5, he could play knight f6, and this I think is not a lot better for white, but it's still better for white. So castles, bishop d6, and now very good move here, knight to c3, sacrificing the pawn. So on knight e5, d e5, bishop e5, there's a tactical point. White has knight takes e4. So time and again in this variation we see that there are tricks with queen h5. So on knight e4, queen h5 check, and then the bishop on e5 drops. So black should disregard this pseudo sacrifice and castle. Bishop to b3 check, king h8. Of course, if d5, white takes on f6 and then takes on d5, winning a pawn for not really enough compensation. So king h8, and now f4 is a nice move, taking advantage of the bishop's poor placement, and white seems to have an edge here. So f takes e4 is playable, but I don't think it's not the best. So the toughest move here is e takes d4, and again, this is not a move that black would play in the regular Schliemann or Yanish, but here it's right. And now white plays e5, bishop c5, and here white can try several things. c3, which we won't look at anymore, but we will look at c3 in some variations or sublines within the other variations we will examine. There's bishop to g5, and there's castling. So we'll look at bishop g5 and castling in more detail. Okay, so bishop to g5, knight g to e7, and now c3. Takes, h6. And this seems to be close to forced for black to play this way. Takes, bishop to b3. You'll see this an awful lot in this variation if you examine it further. d5, ed, queen d6, queen e2. So white's got pretty good compensation for the pawn, certainly enough for it. The rook's going to come to d1, the knights may come to e5 and or d5, and it's at least a little bit difficult for black to castle from here. But still, black is up a pawn and has at least for the moment, has a sufficiently, I don't want to say it's a sufficiently tight structure or setup. I mean, there are some loose points, but it looks like he at least has enough cover to not be in huge danger just yet. He needs to be very, very careful, but I think black is surviving. Although, to be honest, I would not be surprised if some really deep, careful, long-range computer analysis found something great for white. But at least for the moment, both Sokolov in his book from a couple of years ago now, the Ruy Lopez Revisited, and then some of my own work on this, I can't find any really clear advantage for white. So rook to d1, queen f6 seems to be absolutely forced. And here, okay, if knight to d5, the queen should just bravely go back to d6. I mean, there's nothing else for it to do anyway. And again, I don't see a win. I would be scared with black, but he seems to be okay. Or if knight to e5, then bishop to e6 covers f7 and saves the bishop. And again, it's not really clear, and it's also covering the d5 square too. It's not really clear what white has. And if white doesn't do anything quickly, reasonably quickly, black will just castle off to safety. So it's a scary position, but maybe black is all right. Okay, so that was bishop to g5. We'll call castling the main line here. Knight g to e7. All right, now again, white has a choice. He can play bishop to b3 to prevent black from castling, or play this gambit line c3 to open the center and facilitate his queenside development. We'll start with this one. D takes c3, knight c3, black hurries to castle, knight to g5. Here, black should be careful. White has a big threat, and it's not the fork on f7 after bishop b3 check, king h8, not knight f7. Black would just take and then take on e5 with, I think, a pretty good game, but knight takes h7, which would just win. The obvious and crucial point being that king takes h7, walks into queen h5 mate. So after knight to g5 then, black should play h6. Bishop to b3 check, king h8. Okay, again, knight f7 check. We already explained that rook takes f7 followed by knight takes e5 is perfectly good for black. You'll have 2 pawns for the exchange. So queen h5, bishop to d4, knight f7, takes, threatening bishop takes h6. So this is definitely not something that black wishes to allow. So queen f8, bishop to g5, knight takes e5, bishop b3. And Sokolov gives some variations here, but I think I've improved on his line. Or maybe it's fair to say the latest and greatest engine out there improved over his line. You know, software and hardware moves on. So c5. And I like this a lot. In fact, it's a very dynamic way to handle things. So black is just going to mobilize his big, massive pawns in the center and queen side, even at the cost of some more material. So white gets first the f pawn, and now he even gets the d pawn. But after bishop to d7, although white's up a full exchange, black is pretty much fully mobilized and has some real threats coming here. I mean, rook to f8. We're hitting f2, so that we can follow up with bishop to b5. There's also, especially if the queen gets off this h2 b8 diagonal, the possibility of knight to g4 again, loading up there, but also hitting h2. So you can see, I mean, this could be really, really, really unpleasant for white. Also, c4 is a threat in some cases, depending on where the white queen is, as you know, the bishop's protecting the knight. So if we can block that that defensive line, there's trouble. So that shows why rook to f8 is a big threat. I mean, if the queen goes to g3 to stop knight to g4 stuff, then there's c4. If the queen goes to d2 to make sure that on c4 this queen takes d4, well then there's knight to g4 and also bishop b5. So a scary position here for white. All right, so that would suggest then that at least something new is required for white to prove an advantage in the c3 variation. So let's look now quickly at bishop to b3, preventing white, black from castling. d5 is the standard rejoinder, ed, queen d6, rook e1, preventing black from playing bishop to e6, h6, stopping knight to g5, knight b to d2, aiming to play knight c4 and then put a knight on e5. So b5, a4, threatening a takes b5, taking advantage of the pin. Black could play bishop to b7. This is also possible, but it weakens the e6 square. So rook to b8 is, I think the usual move here. Again, let me take a quick check. Yep. Yeah, rook to b8 is played more often and scores better as well. So on bishop to b7, yeah, white generally plays AB, rook a8, bishop a8, and now rook e6. And queen e2 has been played as well. All right. So back to rook to b8. So AB, and now the usual move here, and I think it's the move that Sokolov examines, is knight to f1, which is certainly reasonable, trying to bring the knight to a more useful location. Maybe it can come to h5 at some point. It also uncovers the bishop on c1. But a very interesting move, which hasn't been played, is bishop to a2. And so this strives to activate the knight by a little more unusual route via b3. So it looks a bit funny because, of course, you're blocking the a file, and the knight in turn on b3 will block the bishop on a2. But it makes some sense. Okay, so that's this position, I think, is maybe a little bit better for white, and certainly black is living kind of dangerously in this variation, but there doesn't seem to be any flat refutation of this line. It can be played, and since it's seen so rarely, I think it may not be a bad surprise weapon to take up from time to time with black if you like these positions. If you don't like to defend, though, you shouldn't play it, because white definitely has all the initiative. And it's a matter of whether black can consolidate with his extra material. All right, finally, we'll look at the by far and away most important fourth move alternative, at least in terms of frequency, and that's d6, the deferred Steinitz variation. All right, white has quite an array of choices here. There's c4, there's castling, there's bishop takes c6, and finally there's the main move, which is c3. And of course there's d3 as well, but that's not really a testing line, and at some point we'll talk about d3 variations in general. Alright, so let's begin with c4, which is a pretty rare and largely forgotten move that Paul Keres used to play way back in the 1930s, and even I think the 40s, with reasonable success. I know he played against Capablanca. I think that game ended as a draw, and he beat Olyekin with it, so that's not a bad accomplishment. I actually played this at one point too, and did okay with it, but I would probably recommend one of the main lines. I've played c3 as well and have done fine there. But anyway, c4 is a little bit unusual. So white's trying to set up a Maroczy bind kind of structure, and just try to use that little bit of extra space to keep black cramped. All right, bishop to d7. Here, if white plays d4, there's a very interesting rejoinder, which is b5, with the idea of meeting c takes b5 with knight takes d4. So cb, knight d4, knight d4, e4, queen d4, a takes b5, and black is probably okay here. So instead of d4, it's probably better to play knight to c3. Now g6, d4, takes, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight g to e7. That's not really forced. Black can play knight f6 as well, but this is a solid approach. Castles, and I think black is okay. I mean, black is okay. His threat is to take just everything, just to trade on d4, trade on a4, and there really won't be enough stuff left on the board for the bind to bind anything. Also, in some cases, black could go for f5 and break up the bind in that way. So it doesn't seem that this promises very much for white. It's comfortable. Optically, it looks really nice for white, but I don't think it gives him an advantage, at least not a substantial advantage. So c4, maybe not bad for a little change of pace, but not the most theoretically crucial move. Okay, next up is castling kingside. Now, here I think black's best is probably knight f6. The problem, quote-unquote, with this is that this allows white to return to the main lines. Rook e1, b5, and this position is, of course, the very starting position of the absolute main line of the closed Ruy Lopez, which we'll look at who knows when. But we're getting there. We'll probably be there sooner than you might expect. Anyway, so that's, I think, black's best here. Bishop to g4 is, let's say, the properly Steinitzian variation here. So the key line goes like this: h3, h5, bishop c6, check bc, d4, takes, e d4, rook d1, queen f6, queen b3, knight e7. Here, white has two main moves. There's queen to b7, and there's c3. And c3 I'll discuss a little bit because I think maybe white has an edge here. So white has tried to, this position hasn't arisen that many times, but when it has, it's almost always been with very strong players. And generally, black has done okay. White could try queen e6 here, could play queen b7, could play c takes d4, and could play rook takes d4. And rook takes d4, I think, gives white a small edge. It's not a huge edge by any means, but I think white stands a little bit better after g6, bishop g5, bishop g7, and rook to a4. So his pawn structure is just a little bit better, a little more space, and I think between those two factors, it should be good for at least a tiny edge. Note, by the way, that black can't castle here because white would trade queens and then take the loose knight on e7. And black can't play queen takes b3 and then, well, f6 and then castle because the a6 pawn would drop. So it's a little bit of an uncomfortable position for black. Again, not terrible, but the pressure is still on him. I think the burden of proof is on black to prove that it's equal. All right, so this line I think is okay for white, which is why, again, I think probably black's best off playing knight to f6 rather than bishop to g4. Okay, so we've looked at c4, which I think doesn't give white anything, or nothing much anyway. We've looked at castles, which if black plays bishop to g4 gives white an edge, but if he plays knight f6, just transposes to the main lines. And then next up is bishop takes c6 check. So bc, d4, f6. So this is a little bit reminiscent of the Norwegian variation. Not exactly the same, but pretty similar. Let me flip back to that position here quickly, just so you can see. Right, so here's this, and there's the Norwegian variation position. So quite similar. I don't think white is as much better here as he is, well, sorry. In the Norwegian variation position, I think white has a bigger edge than he does in the Steinitz variation position, which, once again, is this. All right, and in part because the A file is closed, which was a problem in the Norwegian. Here it's not a problem. And also maybe white's a touch behind in development relative to that line. So from here, some possibilities. White can play knight c3. Here black can choose between knight e7, followed by knight to g6, and g6. On g6, maybe h4 is, well, it's definitely playable. It's been tried a number of times, and recently, I think it was Ruy Lopez used it against Yusupov with success. Anyway, so that's possible. Bishop to e3 is the main move, although knight c3 is also a prominent try. Knight e7, knight c3, knight g6, queen e2, bishop to e7, castles queenside, bishop e6, taking the c4 square away from white's queen, h4. So this is a typical idea, h5. And now another very typical idea in this variation for white is to play d takes e5 once he's finished his development. DE is obviously not a good idea here, and after f takes e5, knight to g5, takes, queen to b8, we have a position that's arisen quite a few times. So this is perhaps, I don't know, I wouldn't say it's the main line of the Steinitz deferred, but it's an important position at any rate. Maybe the move that I would recommend here is g3, and eventually white is going to push for f4. Okay, we've got to be careful about when we do it. We don't want to walk into this skewer with bishop to g4, although queen c4 might not be a bad rejoinder against that. And certainly if black is castled, well, okay, the h5 pawn is hanging, so it couldn't happen anyway. But if he had castled and we weren't taking on h5, bishop g4 could be met by queen to c4 check. Anyway, once again, the point of white's play is to prepare for and play f4. And that's how he's going to kind of get something to grab a hold of in the black position and make progress. Black, for his part, is going to try to keep things together, maybe put the king on d7, and go for play along the b file. So perhaps put the queen on b6 or on b4, put a rook on b8, or maybe push the a pawn as far as it'll go. And again, see what he can scrape up over there while trying to keep the king side relatively stable and the center as closed as possible. So I think white is a little bit better here, but it's an entirely playable position for both sides. All right, so that's sorry, that's not the absolute main line. That's the main line with bishop takes c6 check. Yeah, the absolute main line here is with 5c3. All right, and now black has a choice between a solid approach and a sharper approach. The sharper approach is f5, the so-called siesta variation. And why it's called that, I'm not really sure. Maybe it's because it was first played in a country where they took a siesta. Maybe it was played in Mexico or somewhere, again, where a siesta is popular, because it's not a sleepy variation. It's a very, very interesting and lively one. So after e takes f5, bishop f5, castles, bishop d3, rook e1, bishop e7, bishop c2. Okay, white does evict this bishop. It doesn't get to stay there. I think black has played e4 sometimes here, but this doesn't work out very well. Takes, and then I think both queen to b3 and rook to e3 have a good reputation. So what black is counting on in this e4 line is that white is going to have to take so much time getting rid of that d3 pawn that black will have obtained sufficient counterplay in the meanwhile. Maybe, but again, it's much less popular to play e4 than it is bishop takes c2. I mean, it's like 15 times more common. All right, so bishop c2, queen c2, knight f6, d4. So all of this is fairly automatic once black has played f5 on move 5. Here, black has a couple of possibilities. He can play queen to d7, de, and here white doesn't take this pawn on e5. So generally, either rook to d1 or bishop g5 or bishop e3 or knight b to d2 gets played. And I think white tends to score reasonably well here. I mean, it's in a way, it's like one of the Dutch variations. So the Dutch variation where black plays e6 and d6 and then later plays e5. So black has an isolated e-pawn, but has good piece play, will have an open f file, an open d file, and, well, 3 open files if white ends up taking on e5 at some point. But if white can keep this blockaded, can put a knight on e4 and make sure that a knight stays on e4, then he can try to slowly squeeze black to death. Okay, instead of queen to d7, the main move is e4. Sometimes white plays knight f to d2, but knight to g5 is the most usually played move. And now d5, not fearing knight to e6, which doesn't really seem to lead to a whole heck of a lot, which is why white either plays knight to d2 or f3. Well, I can just briefly point out that on knight e6, queen d7, takes, king f7, and the knight has no escape. And if bishop to h6, I think just knight to g4, maybe bishop to f8 also is good, is winning material. So there's not really any grand point to knight e6 then. Alright, so f3, h6, knight h3, and now black does not take because of queen to g6 check, followed by knight f4, with or maybe queen f5, depending on where the king goes, and then knight f4, and black will be in all kinds of trouble. So the right move is to castle, knight to d2, now he takes f3, knight f3, rook f7, knight f2, bishop d6, and bishop to d2. And this is certainly a mainline position, a tabia of the siesta variation. Material is even. Black's bishop looks better than white's bishop, but if white is planting a piece, well, a knight on e5, then that may not be the case. So probably white is microscopically better here, but it's very playable for black. So this is, I think, a perfectly legitimate line for either side to go into. Okay, back to c3. Instead of f5, the main move and the more quiet, more solid approach is bishop to d7. d4, and as we saw in some other lines, black has this fundamental decision to make between putting his knight on g6 via e7 and putting the pawn on g6. So we'll take a look at both moves, and I should say that in both cases we end up with something very King's Indian-like. And as we start to get into more mainline positions of the Ruy Lopez, it's worth noting that we'll see on quite a few occasions as we proceed from here. We won't see it in the open Ruy Lopez, but we'll definitely see it in the closed lines that there are some very strong resemblances between the Spanish and the King's Indian. At least there can be. For instance, okay, let's say black plays knight to g6, knight g to e7, castles, knight g6. White has a variety of plans here, but the most popular one is to King's Indianify it with d5, and now, okay, you could play c4, a bishop to c2, but c4 is the main move. h6 to stop white from planting some piece on g5, knight c3, bishop e7, and also the other point is to support bishop to g5 to trade off this bad bishop. And here white can play either g3 or b4, preparing to advance the queenside pawns, or the simple developing move bishop to e3, which supports c5 as well as developing a piece. Alright, so that, this one at least starts to resemble the King's Indian a bit. Maybe someday black will play for f5. We'll see that the alternative move, which is more popular, g6, is in some ways even more King's Indian-like. So castles, bishop g7, rook e1, knight g to e7, and now d5, c4, and here, for instance, it's very much like a King's Indian. Again, the point of h6 was to prevent knight to g5. So, if f5 here, white would take the bishop on d7 faster than black could recite his own name, and then play knight g5, knight e6. So h6 stops that, and now b4. And white could also trade the bishops. It may not be a bad idea to swap off these light-squared guys straight away and not give the bishop a chance to run. So this is also possible, though we don't really want to help black develop. Alright, so anyway, after b4, not bishop takes d7 here. I think it's a few moves earlier where it's played. Yeah, sometimes it's played here. Anyway, better, I think, for white to just be patient. So b4, and black is going to play f5, and we're off to the races. White is going to push the queenside pawns, open the c-file, and try to show that the c-file and perhaps a weak square like b6 could be subject to an eventual to become an eventual invasion point for white, and black will run the kingside pawns as far as their little legs will carry them, f5, f4, g5, g4, and play for mate. All right, well, that I think is a good place to stop. So you've got some, I think, a helpful overview of some of these fourth move alternatives, especially the important Steinitz defense. Deferred. There are, of course, alternatives for black and for white. So this is not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination, but hopefully it's enough to get you out there able to play it at least a little bit with either color, and to have some general sense of what's going on. Okay, so next time, or at least the next Ruy Lopez show we'll do, we will take a look at knight f6. So we're making progress, and then okay, white's got a few alternatives to castling, so I think we'll look at knight f6 and probably moves like d3 and knight to c3 and d4, and also bishop takes c6. So that'll be enough to keep us busy. Okay, so thanks a lot, and before you guys run off, let me remind you, first of all, to check out my blog. So it's thechessmind.net, thechessmind.net, and also I give lessons, so if any of you are interested, drop me a note on the server here, or through my blog at the contact link, and we'll discuss it. So thanks a lot. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.